Shinji Mikami discusses his abusive dad, Nintendo interview career tango, and his worldwide aspirations. The following comments come from Shinji Mikami himself. On his abusive father, I was a pretty normal kid. I'd play hide and seek or dodgeball with the other kids, and later, in my elementary school years, we'd hold bike days. Kids had to be somewhat creative in coming up with games to play, because there wasn't that much else to occupy your free time. That was something all kids did back at the time, so it wasn't anything special. If I was different in any way, I suppose it'd be how scary my dad was. He would hit me pretty much daily. My dad had to take jobs starting in middle school and wound up dropping out of high school in order to support his family. So I have to respect him for going through that. But he was really just such a violent person. I remember one night when I went to bed without doing my homework. He kicked me out of bed in the middle of the night and told me to go outside. So I did, in my pajamas without any shoes on. And he told me to stand in front of the car. Then he started chasing me around in the car. He wound up having me run about 5 or 6 kilometers, all the way to the seashore by our house. Once we hit the coast, he drove off without saying a word, so I had to walk home by myself in my pajamas. If you think about it, if the police had seen this barefoot boy in pajamas being chased by a guy in a car, they would have arrested him on the spot, wouldn't they? So I think there's a bit to say about this, right? About this violent father that, in a way, I would say it probably shaped him in a way, right? It shaped what he perceived to be scary, and probably this powerful father figure that sort of chased him around in the car and beat him daily. I think that would make sense that it would sort of influence the horror game that he would create in the future, right? Mikami grew up in Yamaguchi Prefecture of Honshu Island. His father, who had to enter the workforce early and drop out of high school to support his family, beat him almost daily. Beyond family life, his was a normal childhood, without video games, but full of outdoor play. Back in those days, kids had to be someone creative. We already read this, right? In his adolescence, Mikami became obsessed with horror films such as Texas Chainsaw Massacre, The Evil Dead. Another hobby was the study of karate and kendo. After failing entrance exams 2 years straight, Mikami enrolled into and graduated from Doshisha University, where he majored in the study of merchandise. When he went to a video game convention and decided to join Capcom. I think he applied to both Nintendo and Capcom. It says here, a friend of mine had found a flyer advertising some kind of a job fair / buffet party Capcom was holding at the Hilton, and he gave it to me because he knew I liked games. I went mainly because I wanted to eat at the Hilton for free, but once I started talking to Capcom people, really getting in depth about the work they do, I thought it sounded pretty neat. So I applied to both Capcom and Nintendo. And it turned out the second round of interviews for both companies were held on the same day, and I chose Capcom. It's likely for the better because I probably never had a chance with Nintendo. His application was rejected at the screening process, then approved 1 week later. He joined Capcom in 1990, as a junior game designer, Mikami and fellow new hires were sent to a warehouse and ordered to think hard about game design. Then, left unsupervised for the entire day. After a few months of just doing that, he was suddenly placed on a team and given a leadership position despite knowing nothing about game development. His first title, a quiz game for the Game Boy titled Capcom Quiz Hatena no Daiboken, was made in 3 months. His 3 subsequent releases were all based on Disney licensed properties: Who Framed Roger Rabbit for the Game Boy, and Aladdin and Goof Troop for the Super Nintendo. Aladdin was his first hit, selling over 1.75 million units worldwide. Mikami also worked on Super Lap, and unreleased F1 racing game for the Game Boy that was scheduled to be released in 1992, but was cancelled after 8 months of development. Mikami learned by observing his seniors. Whenever he showed them his game design documents, they called his work uninteresting without giving any advice. He found his environment comfortable since it engendered independence and freedom of thought. To Mikami, the art of game making was instilled in him by Tokuro Fujiwara. Resident Evil 1993-1996. After the release of Goof Troop, Mikami began development in 1993 of a horror-themed adventure game for the PlayStation. Set in a haunted mansion called Resident Evil, originally conceived as a remake of Sweet Home, an earlier Famicom game by Capcom, based on the Japanese horror film of the same name. Sweet Home director Fujiwara entrusted Mikami, who was initially reluctant because he hated being scared, with the project because he understood what's frightening. I think we can understand why Mikami understood what was frightening, right? Considering that his childhood was, well, quite frankly, pretty frightening if you think about it, being chased in a car. Mikami said that Resident Evil was a response to his disappointment with Zombie 2, a gory 1979 film by Italian director Lucio Fulci. Mikami was determined to make a game with none of the failings of the movie. The resulting game became Biohazard, an action-adventure game which combined 3D polygonal characters and objects with pre-rendered backgrounds, and featured zombies among other monsters, heavily influenced by George A. Romero's Dead films. The game was retitled Resident Evil during its English localization under Capcom USA suggestion and was released in Japan and North America on March 22, 1996, and became one of PlayStation's first successful titles. It was the first game to be dubbed a survival horror, a term Capcom coined to promote the game, and was later ported to the Sega Saturn. There's a lot of interesting trivia about Resident Evil, which we will get into in a second after we will finish reading this section. Resident Evil was considered the defining title for survival horror games and was responsible for popularizing the genre, its control scheme becoming a staple of the genre, and future titles would imitate its challenge of rationing highly limited resources and items. The game's commercial success is credited with helping the PlayStation become the dominant game console, and also led to a series of Resident Evil films. Mikami had creative control over the screenplay and script of the first movie, being dubbed a creative consultant. They had Mikami in this position to make sure fans of the games would be happy. Well, I'm not sure that ended up working out, to be honest. He then dropped out of the later movies because he believed that the movies were heading in the wrong direction. Well, He was correct. He was certainly correct on that one. Many games have tried to replicate the successful formula seen in Resident Evil, and every subsequent survival horror game has arguably taken a stance in relation to it. So now let's talk a bit trivia about Resident Evil. For example, Resident Evil initially was actually supposed to be a first-person perspective game, an idea to which the game returned in Resident Evil 7 years later. Also, in Resident Evil 1 Remake, you have to burn the corpses of the zombies because otherwise they would return as red zombies. And that was a thing that was supposed to be a mechanic in Resident Evil 1, the original game, but they got rid of that concept. And also this thing of cooperation, of a different character following you, like in Resident Evil 0, Resident Evil 4, Resident Evil 5, was supposed to be a part of Resident Evil 1, but also was cut from the final product. So now we will dive in to the game itself. I will say that this game has aged in a very, very specific way, and that now it is famous for its very funny dubbing. It is famous for, well, I believe you will see. Okay? Also, before we jump into the game, I was told that the technical problem might have possibly been solved, so feel free to subscribe or donate, and we will see.
Obey!
It worked! It worked! You know what? I'll take it. I will take it being like this. It worked and it's glorious. Okay? It is glorious.